Hey kids, this is the second part of a two-part video, so if you haven't seen the first part of this two-part video part thing, I'd highly recommend you watch it now.
Follow it now or I'll come to your house. I'll come to your house and it'll be really scary because look at me. I'm a freaking robot.
Alright guys, we're now heading into the albums that still bear a very big impact on me today, pretty much. As I said before, a lot of albums, in terms of my music taste nowadays, I very much like songs and albums that have a very theatrical kind of vibe, kind of a stylistic continuity, or even just some sort of entertaining story or narrative through it. A lot of them cover different types of sounds that are very engaging and dynamic, all the way to just having overarching themes and stories and narratives behind each and every song. So without further ado, let's go into these next ones.
But you got no right to sit there saying, "Are you music?" when you only sleep with girls who say they like your music. Backstabber, 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 backstabber.
Moving on to something that I mentioned earlier about my recent love for burlesque cabaret type music. For those of you that don't know, I not too long ago performed in the production Cabaret over at the Center for the Arts and Sciences, which is essentially the local theater here in my hometown. And it was an absolute blast beginning to end. But back then, I was introduced to a band called the Dresden Dolls. My god, they're a treat. Amanda Palmer is absolutely incredible with the vocals. The drumming in all those songs are fantastic, and a lot of the piano lines in it are so much fun to listen to. The album in particular that I'm referring to is Yes, Virginia, which has all kinds of enjoyable songs such as Backstabber, which starts off going very smooth and kind of a fun, playful piano sound until it leads up to the crescendo of the chorus of just Backstabber. Or My Alcoholic Friends, which is a very fun, burlesque style song, talking about all kinds of different whimsical things, I suppose, that almost seem very loose and kind of the drunken style, you know? All kinds of things like that. Lyrically, it's very witty and clever. To Sex Changes, which talks about a lot of the insecurity and almost uneasiness of basically having your gender change. That's a subject for a video, though, that I'm going to get to eventually when I feel comfortable, at least in terms of myself. And all this album accumulates to the very end, which leads all the way up to Sing, which is a beautiful, almost ballad-esque kind of song. Just nearly brings you to tears, man. I'm gonna be honest, like, that song is absolutely incredible. It basically says no matter what you think you are, no matter how good of a singer you think you are, just go out there and sing. Do it from the heart, do it because you love it. Don't let anyone else get in your way. Don't let your insecurities keep you from just being who you are and letting your voice out into the world. And that song honestly has such a strong message to it that I highly admire. Plus the lyrics to that song, and overall, a lot of the songs on this album have a lot of references, such as Damn It Janet from the Rocky Horror Show, or Life Is No Cabaret from, of course, Cabaret. There are all kinds of things to unpack lyrically within this album. And overall, from the instrumentation to Amanda Palmer's vocals, yeah, a lot of the fun things about that album, just the vocals, to the instrumentation, to the lyrical content, it's an overall fun ride. I'd highly recommend giving it a listen.
Like a little black dress, you're a faded moon, stuck on a little hot mess.
Starting off, it's the album that got me into Fall Out Boy, which is something I didn't want to do for so long. But this album honestly won me over, and to this day, I believe it to be one of the best albums that Fall Out Boy's ever created. And that album is Folie à Deux, or translated, The Madness of Two. This album is an absolute treat. Let me just tell you right now. From the very opening song of Disloyal Order of Water Buffaloes, leading it into the awesome I Don't Care, which is a big middle finger, I don't care, I'm amazing kind of song that just makes you feel like a total badass from beginning to end. Even all the way up to She's My Winona, which has a very cool and infectious drum line to it, with very interesting guitar work, America's Sweethearts, which is incredible through and through, Head First Slide into Cooperstown, which is a very big, bombastic, and theatrical song, in my opinion, that has all kinds of shakeups and changes, to Tiffany Blues, to 27, all the way to West Coast Smokers at the very end. This album is an absolute treat that doesn't let up. Every song kind of flows into the next, and it doesn't feel like it slows down or loses momentum any time. The only thing that I could really say that most people might not enjoy from this album is that this one is a little bit more stripped back sonically. Now, most of the time that'd be a complaint of mine for a rock album, but this album honestly does that to its benefit. It uses a great deal of brass instrumentation, even a few tech elements like synthesizers and things like that. Honestly, this is the most creative that Fall Out Boy has ever been, and I just enjoy it so freaking much. It's influenced a lot of the music that I look for nowadays. As I said, it has sort of a narrative to it that is a little vague and kind of flimsy, but regardless, pretty much a lot of the songs on this album actually cover a very interesting story and theme behind it, and I can't complain. I thoroughly enjoy this album to this day, and I highly recommend, even if you're not a big fan of the alternative genre, you give it a listen.
Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. Beneath the blue suburban sky.
Coming up next, we have the Beatles, by far one of my top 3 favorite bands of all time in general, and we have an album that I don't think a lot of people would suspect. Now, Sgt. Pepper is a masterpiece in its own right, but to me, one of my favorite Beatles albums that they have ever created has to be the Magical Mystery Tour, and as I've said in terms of concept records, this one's fantastic. There are all kinds of different songs that cover all kinds of different stories behind it, from Strawberry Fields Forever, all the way to Penny Lane and all kinds of songs like that, to Full on a Hill. This album is absolutely fantastic. And there are even songs on there that throw you on a loop, from songs like Strawberry Fields Forever, which are very much covers a psychedelic kind of druggy type feel, to the Magical Mystery Tour that does a great job of introducing you to the sound of the album and what you're going to expect for the rest of the thing, to All You Need Is Love, which has a very fun, uplifting, and cheery kind of sound that's almost kind of not even cabaret-esque, but sort of like a marching band, a triumphant end of an album. Even to I Am the Walrus, which is the funniest thing in this entire album, because it's probably one of the first music trolls you've ever heard. A lot of people kind of assume that this song was a result of the Beatles just being really high on LSD or something, or just they were being very deep and they keep dissecting it. No, this song was made to be the most nonsensical thing as it possibly could, very intentionally, because the Beatles were getting tired of people constantly dissecting their lyrics for meaning. So they made a song that consisted of complete and utter nonsense, and I really have to commend them for that. This album, overall, does not have a single miss in terms of the songs on it. And honestly, this is an album that I can just listen to whenever I feel like it. It's just such a fun thing to go through.
Things have changed for me, and that's okay. I feel the same. I'm on my way, and I say things have changed for me.
Moving on to one of the final albums, probably one of my favorite bands, specifically for the reasons I mentioned earlier, we have Pretty Odd by Panic! At the Disco. This, by far, is my favorite album that they have ever created, and really, the funny thing behind it is the story behind how they actually made it. Essentially, they pulled themselves the Beatles, they did what the Beatles did when they made Sgt. Pepper, they locked themselves in the room, they got really frickin' high on God knows what drugs, and they made a frickin' album, and my god is it a fun album. It has a very psychedelic and classic vintage rock kind of sound to it. The guitar work that they have on there is very reminiscent of the type of guitar sound that Jimi Hendrix used for his guitars, or at least it's as close as you can get. It has such an incredible sound to it that reminds you a great deal of the 60s kind of psychedelic scene. It sounds like the Beatles, Panic, and Jimi Hendrix came together and had a phenomenal brainchild of an album, and and that's what turned out to be pretty odd. Now, I can't quite compare this album to all of them, aside from having a very similar sound to the Beatles themselves, but in terms of guitar work, it's not nearly as complex as a lot of those other ones. However, nonetheless, this album is a joy to go through from beginning to end and has such an interesting sonic palette to it. Has all kinds of different string instruments involved, to really cool electric guitar work in there, even to 9 in the Afternoon, which is such a fun trip of a song. In fact, the title of the song is quite hilarious because they were basically locked in that room writing music for so long, and after a while they're just like, what time is it? And I don't even know if it was Spencer, but apparently one of them just said, I don't know, man, but it seems like it's like 9 in the afternoon. So yeah, overall, this album's an absolute blast. From songs that I thoroughly enjoy, like Folking Around, to Northern Downpour, to That Green Gentleman. Oh my gosh, and the closing track of Mad as Rabbits is such a fun way to end it. Even though there might be a few kind of curves to go over for this album has honestly influenced my music taste a great deal, especially Panic at the Disco as a whole band, considering that every album is something new and fresh and oh so theatrical. Honestly, with Panic at the Disco, they're like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're gonna get, and I was pleasantly surprised that they gave us this. And to close this entire list off, I couldn't have this list without, of course, mentioning my favorite band of all time, My Chemical Romance's 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge. Now, The Black Parade is the album that first introduced me to My Chem, and indeed, it did help me quite a bit get introduced to the idea of very theatrical concept albums. However, at the time that I first listened to that, I didn't quite have that mindset. It wasn't until I got into 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge where I absolutely fell in love with this band. In fact, this album, I say, got me through quite a few very rough times. Now, to the untrained eye, yes, it very obviously sounds very intense, and there's a lot of things in these songs, especially in this album, and the album before it, that are very dark and honestly have very disturbing themes if you look into them. But they cover it in a way to try to help people, to try to get mental health and stuff like that out in the public eye. I have mad respect for this album. And at the same time, this album has quite a few narrative flows to it, to the final 3 songs of the album that essentially cover the theme of 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, to I'm Not Okay, which is a song essentially describing the high school experience and how confusing and all the way bonkers it all feels, to You Know What They Do to Guys Like Us in Prison, which is an absolutely manic song with killer guitar work, maddening and absolutely manic vocals from Gerard Way that absolutely portrays a really wild story about prison going, to Helena, which is a tribute song to Mikey and Gerard's grandmother, which honestly inspired a great deal of this album. Honestly, this album is probably the album that has shaped my music taste. Not only because of a lot of the very theatrical sounds to a lot of the songs like Cemetery Drive, to very intense, hard-hitting, and big explosive songs like I Never Told You What I Did for a Living. This album's just a treat, guys. I'm sorry. This album isn't necessarily for everyone. You know, there are lyrics in there that might not necessarily be for everybody out there. It does tackle the subject of suicide, in addition to all these other things that I'm going to have listed at the bottom of my clips from the rest of this video, or as long as it takes to get through them all. Murder and things like that. In my opinion, it does it maturely. Unlike some other bands.
What the f was that?
But anyways, guys, that was the whole video. I thoroughly hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.